Today I want to talk a little bit about my most recent adventure, which involves making watercolors by hand. Recently I've spent a lot of money purchasing handmade watercolors. I have some videos using them. I love them. They're mineral-based watercolors. And I remembered that I own a lot of pigments, well, not a lot, but several, by Sennelier mostly. And I thought, I'm going to try my hand at making some myself. So I did, and of course one thing led to another. I enjoyed it so much that I ended up buying other pigments. So I ended up with quite a few pigments that I mixed with the usual watercolor ingredients: gum arabic, honey, a little glycerin. I add a little clove oil for preservative, and then I enjoyed making a little tiny watercolor journal with them. So first of all, I wanted to show you my swatches of it. And I decided to give them names based on Vermont or inspired by Vermont. So for example, Vermont is silly enough to have a state pie, and the state pie is apple pie. So I named this raw sienna pigment pie crust. We also have a lot of marble quarries. So I have a very pale gray, which I called marble gray. We have a lot of talc quarries too, so I named the turquoise talc turquoise. Of course, Lake Champlain is my middle blue, very commonly used color. Slate is common here. We have a lot of slate roofs the older houses have, so I called my black slate. The word Vermont means green mountain, so I played with that and called this natural earth green, mountain green. And then this is a very cool blue, and I decided to call it, actually this was my husband's idea, winter blue, winter blues we could even say. Our state fruit is the apple, so I have an apple red. And the darker blue, which this is like a deep ultramarine, I call the Adirondack blue. The Adirondack Mountains are in New York State, and we see them at the edge of Lake Champlain. Another kind of slate is called purple slate. You can see sometimes decorative slate roofs, and they use this color slate. Caramel, just because I like it and because that's what this color reminded me of. Of course, how could we not have a color named maple syrup, which is kind of burnt sienna. And finally, Jasper, another mineral that's mined. This is not actually made with Jasper, okay? You can buy handmade watercolors that actually use the minerals that they're named after, but those are prohibitively expensive, and I'm not ready to deal with them. So are these watercolors natural? Some of them are 100% natural, such as the maple syrup, because it's made with sienna. Most of the others are 95% natural. I use a pigment that's 10% synthetic, and it's about 50-50 between the pigment and the binder, so I would say 95% natural. Does that matter? Well, ultimately not really, because the most toxic among the watercolor pigments, such as cadmiums and cobalts, are natural. So natural does not mean non-toxic. It is important to me that all these colors be non-toxic because I do not have a lab. I make them in my home, and even though I'm careful, I certainly would not want to have toxic stuff lying around the house. It's really not worth it to me. So even though my purchased watercolors often include toxic materials, mostly cobalt violet, cobalt blue, and cerulean is made with cobalt, I wouldn't dream of using cobalt in my handmade watercolors. So they're mostly natural, but most importantly, they are non-toxic. They're also rather charming colors that I like, delicate. I tend to go very bright with my colors, so I can appreciate the help given by colors that are naturally less intense. So I made these 3 palettes for some friends that agreed to being guinea pigs. And they're all a little bit different from each other because I didn't have enough. What happens is when you make watercolor you don't really make just one pan, and you end up with several pans. So it's nice to have people to share this with, especially if they plan on actually using them. I made little sketchbooks for them, tiny, mostly to use with these colors that are light and at the same time intense enough that I think are best used in not too many washes. So I made this little sketchbook for myself with this adorable tiny clip. I made it with a paper that's very dear to me because I live in Burlington, Vermont, and this paper is made in Montreal. It's a Saint Armand paper, which makes also delightful, expensive handmade paper. This is not their handmade line. This is their cheaper line. I think it's called Canal paper. It's made with recycled t-shirts, of all things. And I have a little quotation from a poem by Wallace Stevens on the cover, which I think applies to the kind of content that I have in here. And it says, "In my room, the world is beyond my understanding. But when I walk, I see that it consists of 3 or 4 hills and a cloud." I like this because I'm somebody who spends a lot of time in her room, whether painting or reading or grading or preparing for classes, but I also enjoy walking. I walk everywhere. I drive seldom. I walk to work every day. And it is true that in our head, which is the equivalent of our room, things sometimes become overwhelming, and then just being outside and being close to the reality of clouds and hills, for example, kind of keeps things real, so to speak. So the way I've been doing these little watercolor landscapes is first, and that's why I'm including these little pencils, is to make a square with a pencil just to give myself a frame. And then the rest is all done without using a previous drawing. The names I have here are in Italian because I hadn't yet thought of the Vermont connection. And so here, for example, I gradated 3 colors, let it dry, and then did these kind of imaginary flower forms. Here I did something similar, though in 3 stages. The first stage was the water and the air. Then I did the little mountains in the background, and then a tree that's reminiscent of the umbrella pines of my native Italy. Here too, there's actually these are just 2 layers, no 3, because there's this dryness here. So I do 1 bottom layer, then another one with the sky and the background hills, and then another one with these forward hills and the water. This paper is pretty thick, but it's not watercolor paper, so I wouldn't do a lot of layers on it. This too is 3 layers, 2 for the background and 1 for the foreground, a beach scene. This one I'm especially fond of because it is May in Vermont. We had a late starting spring, and it's been lovely to have all the flowering trees, even though in reality there aren't any of that color, but I didn't have any pink, so I use this more peachy. This is kind of a darker moment of somebody walking. The colors make it seem a sad time to me, but we all have those. This is a cheerful seascape, and what's interesting here is that I used that purple slate, which is very dark when I swatched it, but if you dilute it enough, look, it's a delightful little pink. So again, with watercolor, the beauty is you can have tremendous variety just by varying the ratio of water to pigment. There's a little river scene, and I end with a nightscape with the moon and the glow obtained by a lighter blue, and then the darker blue and a mountain. So this is just one way in which one can use handmade watercolors. I think you don't need to be an artist or a watercolorist to enjoy the pleasure of little time spent playing with water and color. So I hope you enjoy this little presentation, and If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And in the meantime, I want to thank you for watching.